look into the nose here, you see these little scroll-like things, which are covered with epithelium that can sort of warm the air, and some of them have sensory tissue there. The one you can see from the front is known as the inferior nasal concha. There's a whole series of those we'll see a little bit later. And way back in here, you can't really see it, it's shown sort of here in yellowish, is the ethmoid bone. And the ethmoid is sort of like the sphenoid. All you ever see from the outside is just little bits and pieces, but when you get on the inside, there's a whole lot more going on. Okay? So these are the bones you should be able to see on the outside of the skull, or we should be able to put, not pins in, but put stickers on in the outside. Okay, so let's see what happens next. Here are a few definitions of things you'll run across in your reading, and we will talk about in the next 2 or 3 lectures. Ala, you should have seen before, it's a wing-like structure. You remember the sacrum had wings on the sides, this part that spread out, and there are other bones that will have wings. Aperture is a fancy word for opening. The nasal aperture is the opening where you breathe in air. A canal is a tube. A channel, the English word is canal and channel are English sort of words that have the same meaning. A narrow tube is referred to as a canal, and we'll refer to a lot of openings that nerves may pass through or arteries may pass through as a canal. A canaliculus is a narrow one of those. It's a little canal or a little tube. A fissure is an opening or a crack or cleft, usually between 2 bones or between 2 parts of bones. A foramen is an opening, just a hole. A fossa is a depression. It's a sort of a pit, an area that's sort of depressed. And a fovea is sort of another word. It's also a pit or depression. A hiatus is a gap. It can be within a bone or between bones. A meatus, not meatus, a meatus is another opening or passage that things can pass through. A process is a bump or a projection. A ramus is a branch, it's like a tree. What it means is a branch. So ramus of a tree. You've heard of rami of nerves in the past. You'll see some rami of bones. A suture. I heard many of you people saying, oh, my skull's really nice. You can see the connections between the bones. The fancy word for connections between bones is sutures. Okay, and these sutures will change with age. In babies, there's lots and lots of big gaps between bones, and as you mature, these things close up and sometimes fuse up. Symphysis is a place where 2 bones come together. It's a site or a line of union. For example, in many animals, the right and left jaws aren't connected. They can move independently. In people, they're connected, and where they come to connect is referred to as the mandibular symphysis. So it's where 2 bones are joined together. And then, bumps get a variety of names. Tubers, tubercles, tuberosities. They're all words for swellings or bumps or knobs that you'll find on a bone. Oh, did everyone get a probe? Did the Ziploc make its way around?
Oh.
Okay, so we've talked about openings, apertures, whatever, with various names. So the big ones that some of which you're very familiar with, some less so. The orbit is a major opening. Your eyeball sits in the orbit, and the nerves that supply either vision or the various muscles that move the eyeball all come into here from the back side. 1 on each side. You have 2 eyes and 2 orbits. The piriform aperture, or nasal opening in colloquial terms, there's only 1 of those, lying, as you know, right below your eyes. And the one you're less familiar with, the external acoustic meatus, which lies out here. That's where you put the Q-tips in, clean all the wax deep in your ears. The ear, the external ear is here, and then there's a canal, and then there's a hole in the bone that goes in there, and the eardrum lies in there. And then on the underside, which we'll see in another slide, there's the big hole, foramen magnum. And that's how the spinal cord gets from the brain out to the rest of the body. Speak of the devil. There's the foramen magnum on the underside, that great big hole there. So the brain lies here in the neurocranium, and coming out this big hole is the spinal cord that goes, as you know, all the way down through the vertebrae. Okay, so we're back where we were with things labeled again. Occipitals, parietals, frontals, sphenoid, temporal. Sometimes, like I said, there are sutures between bones, and sometimes you get little extra bones in between there. They're particularly common back here between the parietals and the occipitals. You'll have a big occipital bone, a big parietal bone, and then along these sutures, they're sort of maybe a little bone isolated there, a little bone isolated there. Here again, here's the zygomatic, the maxilla. We're looking into the orbit here, and as I said, lying on the medial side of the orbit is the lacrimal bone, and then further in there is the ethmoid bone that we will see in a later slide. So here's an example for, as I said, very common area. Here's your occipital bone. Normally you have a parietal bone on each side that comes down, but in this particular individual there's an extra bone between the occipitals and the parietals. And these vary in frequency. Some populations have more of these than others. There's another little bone, sutural bone there, another one right there. So don't be surprised if you look at the back of your skull and you find something more than two parietals and an occipital. Okay, now, these junctions, in addition to having a name called a suture, also have specific names. So that the junction between the frontal bone and the right and left parietals is referred to all the way around, comes over the top, as the coronal suture. And you'll probably recall from Dr. Larson's first lecture that if you run a line from the coronal suture all the way down through the body, that's referred to as the coronal plane. Separates the front half of the body from the back half of the body. Okay, this temporal bone here, which has all sorts of busy parts that we'll learn about later. This flat area is referred to as the squamous part. This thick area with this bump is called the mastoid part. This is sort of the zygomatic part. The suture between the parietal and the squamous part of the temporal bone is referred to as the squamous suture. Okay. The suture in the back that we looked at a minute ago between the parietals and the occipital all the way back is referred to as the lambdoid suture. Because if you look at it, it looks like the Greek letter lambda. Yes, Amanda?
You said the squamous suture separates the parietal and the squamous from the temporal. It doesn't separate the parietal and the mastoid part?
The parietal and the mastoid part. I don't know if that has a separate name. It's usually referred to as here. You see this little dot separating it right there. This is the one that generally has that, hence the name. I don't know if that part has a name, but the area right down here, since you asked, where the occipital comes in contact with the mastoid part of the temporal, and then the parietals come all the way down here, is referred to as asterion. And there are names for lots and lots of parts here. We'll see some of them. Okay? Moving forward. So here's an area.
Wait, can you go over what's an asterion?
What? Asterion is this point right here, where the parietals meet the mastoid part of the temporal and also meets the occipital bone. So these three bones come together in a little triangular junction right there. That's referred to as asterion. There's another multiple junction up here where the frontal and the temporal bones are separated by a junction between the sphenoid below and the parietal coming from above. This quadruple area here where these four bones come in various degrees of contact is referred to as pterion. Okay, and you will refer to various, in your readings you'll refer to problems. Pterion is an area that's of particular danger when we talk about the dura. If you get smashed into the side of the head with a baseball bat or something, because there's so many little bitty bits of bones coming together, that area is a place where bones generally crack, and when they do so, you get all sorts of bleeding inside the skull in particular ways. It has a name because it has a great clinical importance, and it's also varies a lot between different types of primates. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, this little area on the side of the skull, sort of a little process sticking out, not really up against the brain case, but it's like a handle out here. There's one on each side. Is referred to as the zygomatic arch. Okay, and there's made up of the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, and then the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and they come together to connect this. And we will learn a little bit later that one of the big chewing muscles, the temporalis, which originates up here, runs behind the zygomatic arch to insert on the mandible, and another one, the masseter muscle, comes off of the zygomatic arch. And in our dissections, we will chop off the zygomatic arch and dissect a very complicated area back in there, which also has a name. Okay, now, I don't know if you people want to try to find these in your skull or do it in the quiet of your own living room. But if anyone can't find something on the skull, like I said, we're willing to help you. I could slow down. But if you want me to slow down or have questions, just raise your hand. Okay, on the side, I mentioned this earlier, on the side of the brain case up here, you will often see a series of ridges. Okay, these are referred to as the temporal lines. Okay, and the superior temporal line and inferior temporal line. Pretty straightforward. Go.
When we're looking at these bones, different bones,
I have an inferior, but I have a superior.
the sutures that
Have
run
lines?
between them, or
You can feel the ridge.
The individual bones are identified as separate bones because they have sutures between them and other bones of some sort or the other. Sometimes it's pretty much not obvious. The ones on the side of the skull are obvious, but sometimes when you get down on the base of the skull, you can't tell where one ends and one begins as easily. But yes, individual bones can be isolated, and we have a box that has, in this exploded skull, the individual bones have been separated along the sutural lines, and we have examples of the individual bones as well. But yes, that's how we divided it into bones and parts of bones. Okay, another view, or different labels at least. Okay, so here's from the front, the same stuff we've seen. Here's our mandible and maxilla. Looking a little more deeply into the nose, there's a midline structure here. In the course of our dissection, we'll see that there's a nasal septum here, that the right and left side of the nasal opening are actually separated. Okay, things don't cross from the right side of your nose to the left side of your nose. And this bone down here at the bottom is referred to as the vomer. And then the bone that forms the separation from, part of the separation from the top is this ethmoid bone, which is deep inside the nasal aperture. Again, here are these nasal bones, right and left. Okay, there's that sphenoid bone that I said is a lot more complicated than it looks from the side. There's a little part on the side of the brain case. There's another part on the inside of the orbit here. When we get to the inside of the brain case, there's another part there. When we see on the bottom, there's another part there. The zygomatic bone again. between the maxilla here and the temporal bone and forming the side of the orbit. This zygomatic bone, cheekbone. Lacrimal bone just inside the orbit. We'll get a better view of that later. And here's that inferior nasal concha, that scroll-like thing that if you look through the nose. Poking up from the back, you've got the parietals. So what's this area back here where parietals are coming in contact with sphenoid and temporal and frontal? What is that called when they all come together? Pterion. Good. Bless you. Okay, so let's go over this yet again. Frontal. That's the frontal. Okay, we focus in on here. This is what I was saying. Here's your nasal bones here. Here's where your maxilla comes up. And in early development, there is a separation between the right and left parts of your frontal. And sometimes, some individuals, it actually continues. So there's a little bitty remnant of a suture there, and it has a name. It's called the metopic suture, which is very prominent in fetuses and some newborns, but by the time you get to mold, it's usually obliterated and you can't find it. Yes?
So the maxillary, it goes all the way up, you said, right?
Yep, that's maxilla right there. And there's the nasals separating the two sides when you get up at the top. And then they come into the frontal, and there's a name for that point we'll talk about in a minute. And this individual actually still has a little. Are there any metopic sutures in any of yours?
Yeah.
No. What, Mackenzie?
Is it sphenoid, or is it zygomatic that makes the orbital floor? Like, what is that part?
The orbital floor is mostly maxilla back there.
Okay.
We'll get to that. We're going to see all parts in gory detail. Here we are again. Okay, and here we're beyond individual bones. We're talking about parts of the orbit. Okay, so here's the orbital opening. Here is the orbital surface, the part of the front. We're looking at parts of the frontal bone. So the frontal forms most of the roof of the orbit. Okay, so there's the part of the frontal that forms the orbital surface. It forms this upper part of the orbital margin. And the area above this orbital margin here is sometimes